One of the incredible messages that we have to hear loud and clear from this report. It's not too late to avert that level of warming by mid-century, and the trajectories for those most ambitious scenarios would have us reaping tangible benefits in the form of reduced climate impacts by mid-century. Those are the choices we have in front of us, and we have to make those choices about those trajectories this decade. The IPCC report has historically really amassed information about our potential emissions trajectories over the next 100 years and how they translate into warming levels, and how those warming levels of course, come with a known set of impacts that we can, of course, increasingly tie to warming levels and, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. And so the most ambitious trajectories that were considered during this particular assessment report were some of the most ambitious trajectories that were outlined during the Paris Agreement, in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so what we saw coming out of the report was a whole range of potential emissions futures, but it was those ones that were the most ambitious, the really low emissions trajectories that we were looking at very closely to see if we could answer the question, is it too late to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And it just so happened, I think we can say that it's not too late. And that is, again, a very important finding that you're highlighting here. And amidst all the doom and gloom, one of the incredible messages that we have to hear loud and clear from this report, it's not too late to avert that level of warming by mid-century. And the trajectories for those most ambitious scenarios would have us reaping tangible benefits in the form of reduced climate impacts by mid-century. So there's a whole science just in terms of outlining what are these possible emissions futures for our planet over the next 100 years. As you can imagine, you have to take into account population growth, you have to take into account the economic development of different nation states over time. And it's really again, it's its own science. And so what those folks do is hand over these potential futures that track the emissions that may be made each year between now and 2100. And they have to span such a dizzying range. And you look at them and, they're delivering us either a world that's cooling by 2060, or a world that's, on an accelerated warming trend in the latter part of this century. And so I'm quite fond of making that point that you just made, that most of the uncertainty about where we're going with climate change is about the emissions choices that we're making this decade and next decade, and increasingly less and less to do with our ability to translate a given atmospheric CO2 concentration into warming or, of course, related impacts. And that's something that this report also made very clear. When I scuba dive at those sites, I see the same corals growing up over decades. And, I know the reef like I know my house, basically. Every nook and cranny of that reef, I know I call my home away from home. And so when I dive on those reefs and we're looking at an increasing pattern of ocean heat waves and marine heat waves at these sites, it really took the 2016 El Nino event, which was one of the largest on records. We saw it coming for many, many months. And so we planned many expeditions about every 3 or 4 months down to the equator to try to document this event from a scientific perspective, its impact on the reef biodiversity, on coral health, on chemistry, on oceanography, on the atmosphere, on water levels. And so on one of these expeditions, we started to see some massive scale bleaching in 2015 at the research site on Christmas Island. And then another return visit in November, we saw much more, about 70% of the reef was undergoing some stage of bleaching. And then I came back to Georgia Tech and I watched on the satellite temperature feed that, the temperatures were reaching much, much higher levels, 31 degrees Celsius, which was unprecedented at the site. It had never been measured there. And then, I had to think what was happening to the coral reefs there. And indeed, when we went back in April, we saw that the worst had come to be. And of course, it had to be physically and biologically the case that those corals were unable to withstand the extreme duration and intensity of ocean temperatures that occurred during that event. And you have to remember, this is a El Nino event on top of a steady tropical warming trend that is very well documented over the last 50 plus years. And so it's that kind of pile-on that tipped this reef over the edge. When I first got in the water that morning, the reef was unrecognizable in our April expedition. It was just blanketed by red-brown algae kind of wafting in the currents, and there was no color and no structure. And I know I'm speaking to people who love reefs, who know reefs, what that must have felt like to see that. And indeed, I think even though intellectually, in my mind, I knew that I would be looking at something like that, I actually haven't ever recovered from that. Because I think in my back of my mind, I thought somehow the reefs would be resilient. It would be less damage than we thought. Somehow there's a key to Mother Nature we don't understand. Nope. Actually, 85% of the reef was killed during that ocean temperature extreme. One of the things that I've been working on since 2016 is trying to get more and more involved in research on climate solutions. And so I think it's fair to say that most people, well, it's not fair to say, actually, polls show that the majority of Americans are concerned about climate change. They understand the links between greenhouse gas emissions and warming and the kind of climate impacts that we would like to avoid. And so when we think about talking about climate change in a state like Georgia, we're really, eager to connect the dots between the kinds of impacts that people are seeing on the ground. Hurricane Michael was devastating to farmers in South Georgia, for example. They lost pecan crops, blueberry crops that are generations old farms, etc. And so many people are still reeling from that kind of change. On the coastline, we have words that can hardly be spoken: Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Matthew, from the levels of devastation that they raised on our coast. So helping people connect the dots between climate change and these kinds of local risks is really important. So underscoring the tangible risks, but also increasingly helping people understand what we have to benefit from the full-throated embrace of the science. So what do I mean by that? I mean, how can we leverage this incredible information we have from climate science to keep communities safe, to keep them prosperous, to help them be resilient to the coming impacts that we already can see on the horizon? And moreover, how can we make sure that Georgia is well positioned to benefit as the whole global economy transitions to a low carbon economy? So we don't want to be left out of that game. And so again, talking about minimizing risks and maximizing opportunities, that's really what is bringing our conversation together. So here in Georgia, there's something that's coming together called the Drawdown Georgia Business Compact, which brings together business leaders and challenges them to come up with a framework for their own ambitions and walking their own path towards collectively agreed upon goals. And this is what we need to create the kind of momentum and the peer group and the sense of joint action and energy to move forward. And also in Georgia, we're thinking about bringing together institutions of higher education. How can we come together across institutions? Because these institutions are cities within cities, right? And they're the nexus for not just so much economic opportunity and growth and vibrancy and innovation, a term that Governor Ige also used, but they're also where we are training the next generation. And this is where it's critically important that we not leave them out of our climate action plan, that we think about how we're using our universities and our public school systems, which are also vast networks touching hundreds of thousands of people, not just the students, but their families, how we can band schools together for collective climate action. So I challenge you as audience members to think about what are the organizations that you are tied to, whether it's your workplace, whether it's your university, whether it's your children's school or your church. and try to think about how you can band together other organizations within that type of organization and think about what that collective might mean for you. So I'm very excited about that work that we're doing here in Georgia, and I hope to see it, spread like wildfire and really gain traction. The stakes could not be higher going into COP26. And I think that that's immediately apparent to everybody. We now have this huge pile of robust science to guide those policy decisions and understand just what's at stake in our future and how much we're going to need to work this decade. We can't wait for another conference of the parties to roll around for us to get to work. Many of the stars are aligned globally. This is the moment to try to think about bold, sweeping change. Leaders have been talking about this. They've been trying to work forward laws and frameworks and policies in their own nations and at the state level as well. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of ambition and a lot of hope. And now it's time to capitalize on that. I think with respect to Hawaii in particular, I'm really excited to remind folks about the outsized power that the small island nation group had in Paris in 2015 in not taking as the most ambitious target, a target of 2 degrees Celsius. If claiming that is just too high and demanding 1.5. And look where we are today, coming around to the realization that 1.5 degrees Celsius is ostensibly our new target as a globe, that beyond that is levels of danger and risk that we are unwilling at this point to embrace.